right? This is Abraham Lincoln Birthplace, duh, right? Who else are you going to talk about? Well, I'm not going to talk about the Abraham Lincoln that you know, at least not right now. I'm going to start the beginning of the story with a different Abraham Lincoln. And this Abraham Lincoln actually was born in Virginia. And he lived in Virginia after the Revolutionary War, so it's like the 1700s, 1780s, 90s. He had a large family. He had several sons and his wife. And like many people in Virginia, they're looking for land. Because back then, if you want to be a citizen, owning land was very important. So the land they're looking for is out west, and that's Kentucky. Because there's lots of land and it's very good. So all of these settlers are pouring into Kentucky from Virginia through the Cumberland Gap, which is a natural way to come into the state without having to cross the mountains. People like Daniel Boone and Abraham Lincoln. So Abraham Lincoln settled in what is now the Louisville area today. Today that's the metro area. And even today I think there's a sign that says the farm or homestead Abraham Lincoln. So his family grows up there on the site. Now Kentucky traditionally was a very important place for Native Americans for hunting, because you had a lot of Native groups like the Shawnee in Ohio crossing the Ohio River, coming into Kentucky to hunt. You had the Cherokee in Tennessee. And so all these groups consider Kentucky a very important place for hunting big game. And because of that, friction happens, of course, with the settlers. And that's exactly what happened with Abraham Lincoln while he's out on his farm one day with his sons. So a Native American raid occurs on the settlement, and Abraham Lincoln is not, this one at least, is not killed at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. He is killed during this attack on a settlement. However, his youngest son, and his name was Thomas, survived the attack. His older brother Mordecai saved him from being killed. So Thomas Lincoln is not very old at this time. He's a young man. His father is killed in the attack. He survives. However, what happens to the land after the father dies? Who gets it? The oldest one. So the poor youngest one, I'm the youngest child, so I understand Thomas Lincoln's pain. But Thomas Lincoln was the youngest one, and he didn't inherit the land. So he has to learn some way to get by. And one of those trades is carpentry. Has anybody been in the exhibit area and seen that table there? So that's a Thomas Lincoln table that he made for his son and daughter-in-law for their wedding. But in our part of the story here, he's still a young man, and he's still learning carpentry. So he moved to Elizabethtown, Kentucky, which is a small frontier settlement in the early 1800s. And that's where he learned the trade of carpentry, and he got very good at it. He met Nancy Hanks. They got married. They had a young daughter named Sarah. And through his hard work as a carpenter, he saved up enough money in the year 1808 to purchase the Sinking Spring Farm. And that's where we are today. And so what we're going to do now is walk down to where the corner of the property was and talk about this farm. So follow me.
This used to be a motor court, cabins that you could rent for tourists.
Museums or private collections that are not in private collections that we can see around, like Smithsonian museums or...
As far as
The furniture actually came from Mary Poppins. And left it there, and then they gifted that to the country.
What is that Mary Poppins house? Does her family own a house there, or is that...
Yeah, that was Abraham Lincoln.
And this, right behind me, that's no longer there, was the boundary oak tree. And so this marked the corner of the property that he purchased, the far southwest corner of the Sinking Spring Farm. So it went all the way to the north of here, close to where the present-day Lincoln Elementary School is. It went all the way to the east of here, past the Marathon gas station. So we're literally at the far corner of the Sinking Spring Farm that he purchased. The tree lived until the 1970s. It was an oak tree. It was called a boundary oak for a reason, because it marked the property. But the tree was also a witness tree because, of course, in February 1809, shortly after moving onto the property, the Abraham Lincoln that you all know, the 16th president, was born here. We don't know the exact spot where Abraham Lincoln was born, but we do know where that fence enclosure is is the sinking spring. So logically, if you're going to build your cabin onto land that you just moved to, where's your cabin closest to? Probably the water source.
Yes.
And of course, that's why local histories from people who lived here at the time claim that Abraham Lincoln was born on the hill above the spring. And of course, that's where the memorial building is today. We don't know the exact spot, but nonetheless, that tree stood here when Abraham Lincoln was born here. And eventually it died in the 1970s. If you go in our exhibits, once again, if you didn't notice, we have a big slab cross section of that old oak tree. So it lived to be a very old and large tree.
But why did you call it a witness tree?
Well, it was kind of a witness tree, which is a term that refers to a tree that was present when some historic event happened. It's not an official term, but we kind of use, at least in the Park Service, some programs I go on to use that
It
term,
was there
witness
when he
tree.
was born.
It was there. Is also involved in a land dispute. The actual land dispute is very complicated. There were 3 or 4 people involved in the lawsuit. Thomas Lincoln was sued. There was a small debt owed on the property when Thomas Lincoln purchased it. In addition, there was an overall property owner, his name was Thomas Vance. He disappeared with part of the payment for the land. That's the short version of it. But it was actually a very complicated, messy lawsuit. Thomas Lincoln ended up taking his family to Knob Creek while he battled ownership of the Sinking Spring farm. And unfortunately, he lost the entire farm in that dispute. Really of no fault of Thomas Lincoln. He thought he'd purchased a perfectly legal title, but didn't realize there's all these complications with it. So Abraham Lincoln only lived here until he was 2. He doesn't remember the Sinking Spring farm, but he did recall growing up over at Knob Creek. So what we're going to do now is talk about the Abraham Lincoln that you know, the 16th president, below the memorial building. So follow me. Okay, so I need someone who has really good vision. I'm not one of them, so that's why I ask visitors. I already know what it says. But if you look right above these 6 columns here, the second column from the left, it starts with a W. Can anybody read that sentence? It's right above the 6th column. Maybe. With malice toward none, with charity for all. Does anybody know when Abraham Lincoln said that? What major event was happening in our history?
Well, the Civil War.
The Civil War. There you go. Abraham Lincoln said, with malice toward none, with charity for all, at the end of the Civil War. And he said that
his last, like his
second inaugural address after he got second term as president. He said that because, of course, the Civil War was winding down. And he was trying to think ahead to what would happen to this very divided country. So if we think that we're divided today, the country was a little bit more divided back in the 1860s. And saying that speech, of course, was his way of uniting the country. And that's a big part of the design of this building here. So before we actually talk about this, I'll talk about what happened to Thomas Lincoln and the family and the Sinking Spring farm. So of course they left here when Abraham Lincoln was 2 years old, and a lot of other people moved onto this land. Visitors always ask what happened to the original birth cabin. Well, we have no idea what happened to it. Like I tell a lot of visitors, if you have a 2-year-old and your family's about to move, your first thought is not, our son's going to be the greatest president in history. Make sure to keep the cabin intact for the national park folks who come along later. Their thought was, we need to get out of this, land dispute. We need to find a place to go, take the family, that sort of thing. So there are a lot of other people who moved onto the land. Cabin probably fell apart, was used for fences, rotted away. But nonetheless, in the 1890s, the Sinking Spring farm was for sale. And at the time, this was all clear land. There's very few trees here. There was an advertisement in a newspaper for the sale of the Sinking Spring farm, and a very wealthy man saw that advertisement. His name was Robert Collier, and he was the owner of a very important magazine called Collier's Weekly. Most people have never heard of it, but back then, in the 1900s, this was a very important magazine, distributed nationally. Robert Collier was based out in New York City, being a publisher. He had lots of money. And his editor was a big Abraham Lincoln buff. So his editor told him about the sale of the Sinking Spring farm. Robert Collier came up with an idea. And so he told his editor, if you go down to Hodgenville, Kentucky at that auction, I'll give you a blank check, basically is what he said. And he said if you purchase the farm for whatever it costs, do so. Doesn't matter what the value is, whatever, how much your highest bid is. And of course, that's what his editor did. He purchased the Sinking Spring farm. So they decided to create some place dedicated to Abraham Lincoln's memory in the 1890s and eventually the early 1900s. So they get a well-known architect named John Russell Pope to design something here. Now, to get all the money for this big project, they actually created an organization called the Lincoln Farm Association. And when we're done with the program, if you go to the back of the building, look at the sign, and it has some of the members of the Lincoln Farm Association. One of the most famous members that you probably heard of today was Samuel Clemens, or Mark Twain. But back then, this was a big, big deal, the building of a memorial here. John Russell Pope loved European designs, and so he was a well-known architect at the time. He was called the last of the Romans, and you can guess why that is looking at this building here. And so this is the design that he came up with. If you count the steps to the top, there's 56 of them. Any idea why that's important? Abraham Lincoln lived to be 56 years old. If you count the windows around the building, there's 16 windows because he was the 16th president. But the one thing that you can't see is where the materials came from. So in the early 1900s, when they were designing this, they decided to have the materials, the granite and so forth, come from two different places. One of those places was Connecticut and the other was Tennessee. So in the early 1900s, 50 years after the end of the Civil War, why was that important?
To unite both North.
Yeah, it was symbolic. And today that doesn't mean a whole lot to us, but in 1911, when the memorial building was finally completed and dedicated by President William Howard Taft, the symbolism was very powerful because there likely were some Civil War veterans here in the crowd listening to William Howard Taft give his speech about the dedication. So this was national news. And a lot of people don't realize that this was the first Lincoln Memorial. They come here from Washington, D.C., and they ask me, well, wait, where's the statue at? There should be a statue in that building. And I tell them, well, this was the first Lincoln Memorial. The cabin was the thing that they had in here in 1911. The one in Washington was built in 1922. So this was dedicated in 1911 to the American people. It was dedicated to the federal government. The War Department were the first caretakers of this site, and then later the National Park Service in the 1930s. So you go inside and you see a cabin, and unfortunately I assume most of you know already, but for those who don't, the cabin inside the memorial building, unfortunately, is not the cabin Abraham Lincoln was born in. It's a symbolic cabin. And you're probably wondering at this point, why is any of this important? Because Abraham Lincoln doesn't remember the Sinking Spring Farm, for what we know. The cabin inside the memorial is not the cabin that he was born in. Well, the importance is the symbolism that that cabin has. Because Abraham Lincoln believed in the idea of opportunity, that all Americans deserve opportunity in life. And that's the one thing that we have today in a very divided country in common, is when you go inside, you don't see a statue of a European monarch, you see a cabin. And that's the opportunity that represents Abraham Lincoln's idea that all Americans can rise from a humble beginning and still become the President of the United States.